Good morning. You all hear me okay? Okay. Well, good morning. If you'll turn with me in your Bibles, if you have them with you this morning, we're going to be continuing on in Matthew 5. If you've been with us these last few weeks, you'll know that we've been working our way through the Sermon on the Mount. And in this particular section of the Sermon on the Mount, we've been seeing how Jesus is commending this superior righteousness of his kingdom and the superior righteousness of the people of his kingdom by contrasting that with really the superficial and the self-serving righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. So we've seen that Jesus has been doing that through these 6 pairs of contrasting statements, right? We talked about this, called them Antithesis Statements. Why? Because in each case we see Jesus, make this pattern that emerges where Jesus says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." And in each of these cases, Jesus is raising some teaching, some aspect of a teaching on the Old Testament law that the scribes and the Pharisees have gotten very wrong. And he's bringing that up, and he wants to show that they have not only gotten this wrong, but that he has come to, as he says earlier in chapter 5, to actually fulfill the law and to fulfill it in his people. And so in each of these cases, we've seen how Jesus is highlighting the superior righteousness of his kingdom, and he's clarifying really the true spirit of the law. Because the problem with the scribes and Pharisees in each of these cases isn't simply that they're legalistic only, or that they only care about obeying the law and nothing else. No, it's that they've really taken the letter of the law and distorted it for their own purposes. And in doing so, in almost every case, we've seen how they've sort of fundamentally gotten it wrong. They've fundamentally misunderstood the heart behind what God's law has to say on these things. And so the same is true for us this morning. So we're going to be looking at the 5th one of these statements regarding our response to what it looks like when our rights are potentially in a position of being infringed. So if you'll turn with me to Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42, and if you'll read along with me. "You have heard that it was said, 'An eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth.' But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you." Now, at first glance, we read these words, and I think it would be understandable for us to look at these things and to ask, what do all these things have to do with one another? In some sense, it seems like Jesus is really covering a wide range of issues here, right? He's dealing with everything from justice to personal insults to lawsuits to forced conscription and even charity. And so we might, if you're like me, you read this text and you might be asking yourself, I understand what each of these things mean. It's straightforward enough, but what do these have to do with one another? What is the principle or the point that Jesus is laying down for us this morning? And I think before we jump into the text and really expand on that and see that, I want to commend this to you. And I think this is the principle that Jesus has for us here in this text this morning, and that's this. Truly righteous people, the people of his kingdom, do not assert their own rights, but willingly lay them down. I think that's the point that's being stressed in each of these examples that Jesus is giving. And so as we look at the various pieces of our text here and the examples that Jesus is giving and consider how he's contrasting this to what the scribes and the Pharisees have to say, that's the idea that we want to keep in mind, that Jesus is really commending to us a kind of mentality or a spirit when it comes to our own rights, that we willingly lay those rights down instead of trying to assert those rights over and against what others would do to us. So to help us see this, we're going to take much of the same sort of track that we've taken in the last few weeks, which means we're really going to be asking kind of three main questions of the text this morning as we look at this. And those three questions can kind of serve, if you take notes, these are really sort of your three major points that we're going to be looking at. And those three questions are this: what did Moses say about this issue? What are the scribes and Pharisees saying? And what does Jesus say? Right? So those are the three questions that we want to be concerned with. The same questions we've kind of been asking in some form or fashion of each of these statements are the questions that we want to be asking this morning. What did Moses say, or what does the law say? What are the scribes and the Pharisees saying? And what is Jesus saying? So let's consider that first question. What did the law say about this issue? And really, what is the issue? So like many of the other statements we looked at, Jesus begins here by quoting part of a statement. And it's a statement that at least is found in part in the Old Testament law, like many of the other statements we've seen. It's a statement, the statement of an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. And this statement's oftentimes referred to as the lex talionis, or the law of retaliation. It's a principle that shows up in at least three different places in the Mosaic Law. So the first time we see it is in Exodus 21, verses 22 through 25. The example is pretty specific there. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there's no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. This same idea comes up again in Leviticus 24, 17 through 22. Whoever takes a human life shall be put to death. Whoever takes an animal's life shall make it good, life for life. If anyone injures his neighbor as he has done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him. Whoever kills an animal shall make it good. Whoever kills a person shall be put to death. You have the same rule for the sojourner and for the native, for I am the Lord your God. And again, finally, Deuteronomy 19, 15 through 21, a single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only the evidence of two witnesses or of three witnesses shall a charge be established. If a malicious witness arises to accuse a person of wrongdoing, then both parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who are in office in those days. The judges shall inquire diligently, and if the witness is false and has accused his brother falsely, you shall do to him as he is meant to do to his brother. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and the rest shall hear and fear, and shall never again commit any such evil among you. Your eye shall not pity. It shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Well, what's the principle behind each of these three statements? What is it that is being commended to us by Moses and by God through the law's teaching on these things? Well, I think in these three examples, we really see two important principles of justice, right? And they're two principles that should be fairly familiar to us. So the first principle is what we might call retributive justice. And the idea behind retributive justice is really three moral assumptions. And those are this: those who commit serious crimes deserve to suffer punishment for their crime. That punishment must be proportional to the nature and severity of the crime itself, and that punishment must be objectively assessed and exacted by a legitimately appointed judge, magistrate, court, or jury. So this is really the moral bedrock of almost any functioning justice system throughout history. You look at any good functioning justice system, whether it's the justice system here in Israel or even our own justice system, when those justice systems functioned well, it was on the basis of this principle of retributive justice. But then behind this, I think there's a second, even more fundamental principle that is being commended, and that is this principle of personal rights. And we're really familiar with this as Americans, aren't we? We hear this word a lot, and we hear this word a lot nowadays. We have a very good sense of this, right? If you're in school, you probably know the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, of course, behind these same Old Testament laws is a similar ideal. It's the idea that these people, God's people, as people who are made in God's image, have a certain kind of dignity and a certain kind of honor, so that when their rights are infringed upon, when they are harmed either in person or in dignity or in property, that some kind of restitution that's proportionate to that harm must be made to restore the dignity of that person, and thus really restore the dignity of God himself, right, as those who reflect his image. So these are two bedrock, solid principles, right, behind what it means to do justice in the Old Testament and even in our own culture. And so these are important things for us to keep in mind when we think of the lex talionis, or this idea of an eye for an eye or tooth for tooth. Those two principles are really kind of underneath and taken together with that idea. And so now we have to ask then, okay, we understand what the Old Testament has to say to us concerning this issue. So is this a problem? Why is Jesus contrasting this statement? Why would Jesus raise this issue and say, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, but I say to you? And again, we want to be careful, because a similar issue that we've seen time and time again is the tendency to hop into a text like this and to assume that Jesus is standing over and against what the law had to say, that Jesus is sort of challenging what the law taught on this matter. But of course, remember, Jesus made it clear, I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So, as I said last week, the issue here is not Jesus against the law or against Moses. It's Jesus and the law against the Pharisees. And so Jesus is doing something really crucial here in each of these statements, and that's he's showing us by both the statement he commends and then the contrary statements he makes, how the Pharisees have gotten it wrong and what the true spirit of the law is. And so what does Jesus say here, and how does that teach us what exactly was wrong with the way the scribes and Pharisees were taking this idea of the lex talionis, and how were they distorting it? And we'll get into, in a second, sort of the positive commendation that Jesus has for us here. But before we get into that, we really have to ask that question. How are they getting it wrong? What was the problem? Because I don't think the problem, first and foremost, was simply an appeal to justice or this idea of personal rights. So we might be scratching our head, trying to figure that out. If you're like me, you might do that for quite a while. Well, how do these two ideas relate to each other? What is Jesus trying to do here? And again, the problem is not a rigid interpretation of justice, or even this idea that maybe I think the Pharisees, we might be tempted to think, well, maybe they're being too harsh. They're too concerned for justice. They're too concerned for personal rights. And I don't think that's the issue here. I think the issue is very similar, again, to what we've seen time and time again. I think we're again, to see what's happening here and to ask, how were the scribes and Pharisees taking these principles and twisting them for their own self-serving purposes? And I think as we step back and we consider the various examples that Jesus is going to give to us, I think a picture starts to emerge of maybe how they were distorting this. And the picture that I see, that we can see, is this. It seems, I think, that we can reasonably infer that the problem here is not that they were concerned for justice or for their own rights. It seems likely that they were using this principle of personal rights and retributive justice as an excuse or a justification for thinking that they had the right to respond to evil with evil, or the right to refuse even to do good because of the potential it might have to infringe upon their own rights. So in other words, we've seen that the whole point of the law's teaching on this matter was to take justice out of the hands of the individual, to restrain evil, and to ensure that the rights and dignity of people were upheld by putting it into the hands of a fair and objective court. Right? The whole point of this system was to restrain any kind of hint of self-seeking or self-administered justice. Therefore, to take the letter of the law here and to turn it on its head in some sense as a justification for seeking one's own rights, for asserting one's own rights, and even taking justice at times into our own hands and refusing to do good even, well, that's to turn the whole point of the lex talionis on its head. It's to use this idea of justice and rights to say, no, I'm going to get what I deserve. I deserve something here, and I'm going to make sure that I get what I deserve. And it seems that this was the problem that Jesus is confronting with the scribes and Pharisees. Not simply a concern for justice, but using justice as an excuse, ultimately, to seek and assert their own good over and against the good of others. And I think it's important for us to recognize this, and it's important for us to reflect on this, because in a lot of ways here, I mean, this is especially pertinent for us, right? I mean, as I said before, we live under a nation, we live under a government that is founded upon these strong principles of adherence to these ideas of retributive justice and personal rights. And so a lot of our public discourse, we're familiar with this, really centers pretty continually on the intersection of these ideals. And what does it mean to carry out these ideals? Much of our conversations surround these two very ideas. So hear me when I say that there is a place in public discourse for standing for these ideals. There's a place for advocating for the rights of others. There's a place, absolutely, for advocating for justice. You know, as the Supreme Court continues to hear arguments concerning the Mississippi abortion case, and we're standing in many ways at a significant moment concerning how our own courts, the highest courts even of our land, are going to apply these very principles or not apply them to the rights of unborn. And so these are important ideals that we have every right to be concerned with. They're not unimportant. But as important as they are, and as much as we hear about them and talk about them and give time and energy to them in our culture, and in many times we should, Jesus is giving us, I think, a warning here, an implicit warning when we consider the way the scribes and the Pharisees took these principles and misused and even abused them. I think Jesus is showing us that it's incredibly easy for all of us to take these principles, these good, true principles, as a justification for our own vengeful and self-seeking nature. All of us should be desperately cautious and humble when it comes to how we appropriate and apply these principles, especially to our own selves. It's one thing to advocate for the justice and rights of others. It's quite another thing to use sacred principles of justice and personal rights as a justification for greed or envy or spite and even self-satisfaction. And that danger is not a danger that I think any of us should think is something that merely belongs to one political side or the other, right? This is a danger that lies deep in all of our own hearts. We all have the propensity to take these principles of justice and rights, and turn them for our own good, turn them for our own purposes, distort them, and to be blind to the reality of that. We all, at one point or another, have used these principles to assert some right to our own benefit or our own good over and against that of others. And we've even used them to justify a lack of doing good at times. Deep down, all of us have this propensity to care more about ourselves, ultimately, than we really care about justice or the rights of others. And recognize that's why God instituted these laws in the first place, right? Why was lex talionis necessary? Why was it necessary that God take this kind of justice and this concern for one's own personal rights out of the hands of the individual and put them into the hands of the court? Well, it was to ensure that the execution of justice would be fair, would be impartial, would be objective, would not be in the hands of those who have a vested interest in seeking their own good. Right? All of us, deep down, have a desire to assert our own personal sense of justice. And left to ourselves, this would consume us. I mean, it would utterly consume us. Parents, how many times have we seen this, right? How many times have we done this? You know, you go into the room, you hear a commotion, and someone's crying, and you ask, what's going on? Well, he kicked me. Why did you kick your brother? Well, he pushed me. Okay, why did you push your brother? Well, he stole my toy. Why did you steal his toy? Well, I asked him if I could play with it. He said no. It's a relatively minor and somewhat silly example, but do you see the escalation there? The self-serving mentality that happens. That's even just so natural to our own heart, even when we're children. Someone does wrong to us, and we want justice. And we want to execute that justice. And we want to be vindicated. You know, I'm not talking about self-defense or legitimate concern for seeing justice done. It's that natural tendency that we all have in our own hearts to want to get our just deserts. And that's the issue here that the scribes and Pharisees, I think, are putting on display for us. I think it's a sad reality that sin can even distort a good desire for justice. That sin can even distort these good principles of justice and personal rights. That sin can take all of this and warp it for an excuse and even an occasion for evil. So, friends, I think all of us really ought to heed the warning here. We're to be careful to examine our own hearts when it comes to our desire for personal justice. We should be careful to examine humbly our desire to assert our rights. Let me encourage you, don't be quick to seek justice for yourself. Do not be quick to assert your own rights. I'm not saying you can never do that. I'm not saying there aren't occasions where that's important. But recognize that that's a thin line at times. Recognize your motives are what matter here. Right? So, you know, a great example in some sense of this is, I think quite ironically, even after this teaching, one of the things that I wrestled with was, you know, Jesus says some of these things here, but there's a distinct moment in Paul's own ministry where he asserts his rights as a Roman citizen. And I kind of wrestled with that, and I'm like, what's going on there? How do I make sense of that? But the more I thought about it, the more I kind of just sort of thought to myself, oh, of course. And if you know anything about the situation, it's clear Paul doesn't care about his rights. Paul's concern is not for his just deserts. Paul is using his rights, quote unquote, as a Roman citizen for the kingdom. He's using them as a way to get an audience with those he might be able to share the gospel with. Paul is cleverly knows well, this is an occasion where I can say, I've got some rights as a Roman citizen to be heard by the judge, and really all Paul cares about is he wants to share the gospel with that judge. And I think it's clear that even then, in some ways, it's a beautiful example of this very principle. That Paul isn't asserting his rights because Paul ultimately cares about his rights. He's using that for the kingdom. And I think that's the principle that Jesus has for us here. And so to really see this, to really get this clear to us and to understand what Jesus is calling us to, because it's not just a matter where Jesus is saying, hey, don't misuse justice and personal rights. No, remember, Jesus has told us that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, then you cannot enter the kingdom. And so what does it mean for our righteousness to exceed the scribes and Pharisees here? It's one thing for us to recognize, okay, don't misuse justice and personal rights for our own end, but Jesus is going to commend to us an even higher example. And as we examine the bulk of Jesus' words here in 38 through 42, we see not just an implicit condemnation of the scribes and Pharisees, but really this higher principle of how we as his followers are to respond when it comes to issues of personal injustice and personal rights. And Jesus is going to illustrate this to us with really four different examples or illustrations. And to see what Jesus is saying in all four of these illustrations, we should be asking this question as we look at each of these cases. What do each of these things have to do with the lex talionis, or with this principle of an eye for an eye? That's a key question. You want to see You have heard it said, and then you read Jesus' statements, and you should be asking, what do those two things have to do with each other? Well, I think when it comes to this issue of retributive justice and personal rights, we can see a kind of pattern behind each of these statements. If you step back and look at all four examples, really Jesus is raising this issue of the potential to have one's own rights infringed. In each of these cases, the example that Jesus gives is a clear example of potentially having your rights, either your honor, your right to honor, your right to your own belongings, your right to your own freedom. He's encouraging a kind of response to this infringement to your rights that displays a willingness, a radical willingness even, to lay down those rights, showing a kind of radical freedom from this kind of consuming desire for asserting our own rights. I think that's the principle behind each of these cases. A willingness to lay down our rights because we are people who have been made radically free from a concern to assert our own rights. So let's consider how this is being made in each of these cases, right? So we had the first example, which is pretty famous. We've probably all heard this, turn the other cheek. I mean, we don't have to even be Christians necessarily to use or even to have heard this statement. And I mean, it's kind of made its way into our culture. The idea is straightforward enough, right? If someone dishonors you by striking you on the cheek, turn and offer them your other cheek. You know, the picture here is an open-handed slap. It's not a matter of someone trying to do you personal injury as much as just trying to dishonor you, trying to make you look less than worthy. And that's an important thing because there are both in the law and in our own law, you do have a legal right to your own honor. This is why we have things like libel laws. It is illegal for you to publicly dishonor someone in some sense. You would get in trouble for doing something like this. This was not an okay thing for someone to do to you. So what does this have to do, right, with this issue of justice and personal rights? Well, I think in short, Jesus wants us to see that if someone would infringe upon your right to personal honor and your dignity, you should turn and offer them your other cheek as well. Why? Because it shows a radical lack of concern for your own personal rights. A radical lack of concern to need to assert your rights over and against theirs. And he further drives this home with the rest of the examples. So in the next example, he brings up this picture of someone trying to sue us for our tunic. Now, we don't wear tunics or cloaks, but the point here is significant. According to the Mosaic law, your coat was an inalienable possession. You couldn't take someone's coat. You could take their tunic. It was legally allowed. Say if you had a legal dispute with them and you were suing them and trying to get their tunic, you said you had some kind of right, legal claim to it, well enough. But no matter what someone had done, you couldn't take their cloak. And the idea, it's kind of funny and in some ways sort of backwards, but the tunic was actually the sort of inner wear, the cloak was the outer wear, but the idea seems to be that we can't take that because that's basically their blanket, that's their coat. If they don't have that, and if you've taken the thing below, well, then they're totally naked, and they've got no way to protect themselves. And they would literally use this cloak as a blanket. So when they slept, they didn't have another blanket. This was their blanket. They would sleep in this cloak. And in Deuteronomy and in Leviticus, it's really clear you can't take this from someone. You can sort of receive it as a pledge, but you have to give it back to them by sundown. They have to have it. They have an inalienable right to it. You cannot take it from them. And yet, what does Jesus say here? If someone would seek your tunic, give him that which is yours inalienably. They have no legal claim to it, no right to it. They can't take it from you. But Jesus says here, give it to them freely and willingly. Again, it's an intentionally, I think, extreme example, but Jesus is trying to make the point that when it comes to our attitude towards our own rights and our own personal possessions, we should be people who demonstrate a kind of radical freedom when it comes to our concern for our own needs or our own rights. Even over those things that we have a right to assert. Jesus' point here is you have every right in some sense to say, you can't take this from me. You cannot have this. And Jesus says, no, give it to them. Let them have it. And again, Jesus stresses this point by turning this example of the extra mile. This is, again, one of those statements, right? We hear this all the time, and there's probably people who use this statement all the time. And we hear a lot in work context, like, I really want you to go the extra mile and work hard here. And in some ways, it's kind of a misuse of this. But the idea here is really, it's forced conscription, right? So it was a common practice for Roman soldiers and officials to actually forcibly requisition someone to act as a kind of guide or courier for them. So, we have this famous example of this, right, in Simon the Cyrene, who's forced by a Roman soldier to carry Jesus' own cross. That's exactly what's happening in that instance. The soldier is forcibly sort of conscripting that man to serve as someone who carries this cross. And the Romans would do this often. Anytime they were passing through an area, they would assert this kind of right over those who they were ruling over, and they would say, hey, you're coming over here, and you're going to help me. I need help, and you're going to do what I tell you to do. And as those under Roman rule, they had no right or no ability to refuse this. And then I think for those who were under Roman oppression and occupation, Jesus' words here would have been, I think, utterly shocking, if not offensive. I mean, Jesus is saying to them, those people that are oppressing you, let them oppress you. In fact, don't just let them oppress you. Go even further than what they would ask of you. And again, it's an intentionally radical example that shows those who would infringe upon our personal freedoms, well, we can respond as people who are radically free from a concern for self by willing to not just go that 1 mile, but even that extra mile. And then finally, Jesus gives us one last example. And in some ways, I found this to be the hardest one. I wrestled with this and thought, what does this have to do with personal rights? What does this have to do with justice? In some ways, a lot of the other ones that we've looked at, in some form or fashion, Jesus makes a statement at the beginning about don't resist the evildoer. And in some way, we can see in each of those other 3 instances, well, clearly the person sort of trying to infringe upon your rights here is they're trying to do you harm. They're trying to do something to you you don't want. They're an evildoer to you in some sense. But what about someone who begs? Someone who would ask to borrow something from you? I mean, is that wrong? Is that evil? What's the point here? Why is Jesus lumping this issue in? Well, I think the point is this. I think, again, consider our own propensity. What is our own natural reaction to the idea of charity? What is our own natural reaction to those who are in need? How easy is it for us to say, I earned what I got. You don't have any right to what I have. It's mine. Why should I give it to you? If you want it, you work hard like I did. And behind that kind of sentiment is a kind of appeal to a sense in some twisted way of justice and rights. We're using those ideals, again, those principles to say, why do I have to give something to you? Now, there are cases where wisdom is absolutely necessary here. And I don't think, again, in using these hyperbolic examples, that Jesus is trying to say, anytime you see anyone asking for anything, you have to give it to them. I think to read that or to make that a law here, that would be to miss the point of the principle that Jesus is trying to get us to see. No, I think what Jesus wants us to see is, again, we should not be the kind of people who use this idea of justice and rights as a justification for not doing good. How easy is that? How easy would that be? And even in appearance's sake, who could fault us? We can hide behind that idea and say, well, I don't need to give them that. I don't owe them that. They don't deserve that. But again, Jesus wants us to see that true freedom is not about primarily asserting our own rights, but being people who are radically free to lay down those rights. And that's what true freedom, I think, is really about. People who are truly free use their freedom for righteousness' sake, as Peter says. So when taken together, these examples really illustrate, I think, the principle that I commended to you there at the beginning, that it's the truly righteous who do not assert their own rights, but willingly lay those rights down. Why is that important? I mean, why does Jesus go this extra step? Because it would be in some ways enough to simply say, don't misuse justice. Why is he calling us to this kind of radical willingness to lay down our lives? What does this say about us and about God? Well, I think, for one, it shows that as people who have been made free in Christ, that we have entrusted ourselves to the justice of our God. That we're people who are confident that nothing, in some sense, can touch us. That he will deliver us from every evil and bring us safely, as Paul says, into his kingdom. And that kind of concern, that's reflected to those around us when we respond in these kinds of ways. When they see this, they can look at us and say, what is this? Who is this kind of person that doesn't feel this need to hold on to these rights? What is this person who would willingly give these things away? What do they have? What are they banking on? What are they hoping on? Because if they don't hold on to these things, then they'll be destroyed. That's the natural tendency of all of us, right? But the principle and the attitude that Jesus is commending here, it speaks to something radically different. It speaks to a kind of hope and trust in our God. It's something that Jesus is going to continue to unpack, right, as we go through the Sermon on the Mount. It's something he's going to unpack in the next chapter when he talks about, don't be concerned about the things of this earth, but seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, right? We've heard that famous statement. I think in a lot of ways, Jesus is really just continuing to unpack that. And it's something that we see throughout, right? What other examples do we see of this? Well, I think in the Old Testament, we have a famous example of this in the case of Joseph. And Joseph was one who willingly suffered and endured injustice, and God's glory was displayed in that. Joseph showed that he trusted God over and against the faulty righteousness that he either could assert or that this world could give him. But finally, I think the reason this is significant is because ultimately it reflects the character of our God. Levi read for us Exodus 34, and even there we see that God is not just just. He is that. That's clear. But he's also merciful. And we are those who have been shown mercy instead of justice. And that justice has fallen upon Christ for us. So when we live like this, when we respond in these ways, we are showing that we are those who have been shown mercy and likewise are willing to show others mercy in order to display the character of our God. And right, this is so clearly put on display in the life of Christ. As Isaiah says in Isaiah 53, 7 through 9, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep before its shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and as for his generation who considered that he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people, they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. And why? Why would he endure such hostility when he was innocent? Why was he silent? Why was he willing to have all of his rights stripped away, his honor, his dignity, his goods, even his right to justice? Why was he willing to be consigned among the wicked? Well, the author of Hebrews tells us, so that he might be the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, so that he might now be found seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Friends, Jesus endured all of this. Jesus was willing to forego his rights and laid them down so that you and I might be shown mercy and might be reconciled to our God. So if you're with us this morning and you don't know this Jesus, let me encourage you, look to his example, not just as a good, positive example for how you should behave, but more importantly, look and see the injustice and the shame that he endured for your sake. Look and see how he has put himself in your place. He was innocent. You and I cannot say the same. And though he was innocent, he took on the justice that we deserve. Though he had every right as the God of the universe to assert his rights over his creatures, he laid down those rights. Can you think about that? Can you imagine? There is no one who laid down their rights and condescended in a greater way than the God of this world. No one could compel him or had any right to compel him to do that. And he willingly did it so that we might be reconciled to God. So if you don't know this Jesus, I would just encourage you, put your hope and your trust in him. Look to him. See what he's done for you. Turn from all of your self-seeking and all of your desires for your own justice and trust yourself to him. But for those of us who do know him, what does this look like for us? What would it mean for us to embody this kind of radical freedom? Well, I think it would be a huge mistake for us to try to take this and create, hard and fast rules. It's unlikely that almost any of us are ever going to be faced with examples that even look remotely close to the ones we're looking at today. We're probably not going to be conscripted by a Roman soldier. Probably not going to be slapped in the face, though it could happen. Maybe someone might sue us. But the principle here is what matters. And so, again, I think we want to be careful of recognizing it's the attitude here that's significant. And in a lot of ways, the struggle for me here is the implications and really the applications for this are almost limitless. I mean, we could spend easily the rest of today and on into tonight talking about how what Jesus says here intersects with any number of social and ethical and political questions. And I would love to do that, but I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. But you're likely to walk away from this and have hundreds of questions. I mean, there's so many different areas. And I wish I could give you answers to all of those things. But for our sake and really for the time that we have together, I think it's enough to simply ask this. What would it really look like for us to live as people who are radically free from a concern to seek our own good and our own rights? I mean, what are those places in our lives where we can and maybe even should lay down our rights to show that we're radically free in Jesus? Where are those places that we can use our freedom not to seek our own good, but the good of others? Where are those places that we can exemplify the character of God and our trust in God by laying down our rights? I mean, husbands, what would that look like in your marriage? I can think of so many places and so many ways that God every day gives me an opportunity to lay down my rights as a husband for the good of my wife. Parents, what does this look like in your own relationship with your own children? Right? There are so many ways and so many reasons why it would be easy to say, well, I'm the parent, you're the child, and I have authority here. But what would that look like to show your children this kind of mentality? Siblings, what would it look like for you to lay down these kinds of rights for your brother and your sisters? To not respond with evil when you are sinned against? To not kick when someone punches? Again, recognize that if you want to follow Jesus like your mom and dad, that's the kind of person that Jesus wants you to be. That's the kind of person that he wants to transform you into. Someone who doesn't seek their own good, but is willing to lay down those rights. What would this look like in our jobs? There's so many places where we feel that initial desire to rise up and get what's ours? And how can we demonstrate the gospel in our own jobs when it comes to this issue? Not asserting our own authority, but asserting our trust in the character of our God. And I'm not trying to be cheeky when I say this, but friends, in a lot of ways, those questions that I've just raised, if you want answers to those questions, let me commend that you read the New Testament epistles. And that's not just my way of sort of punting on that and saying, go read the New Testament. No, I think one of the things that I find remarkable is, as I consider, especially in the latter half of most of the New Testament epistles, you see a lot of these what are called ethical instructions about how we're to live as Christians. And in a lot of these places, it's really just an application of this principle. When Paul or Peter are dealing with what does it look like for us to live as Christians? What is the husbands? How are you to live? How are you to treat your wives? How are we to treat how is a slave to treat his master? How are we to do these things? How are we to respond to the government? I mean, all of these instructions that we see in the New Testament, in a lot of ways, they're simply an application of this very idea. So I would encourage you, maybe crack open 1 Peter chapter 2 and read that this afternoon. I think you'll be amazed at the way that Peter takes this idea. Peter, the very one who was the quickest to assert his own rights, even to the point of cutting someone's ear off for the sake of Jesus. He learned what Jesus, I think, is trying to say here. And that's evident in his words there in 1 Peter chapters 2 and through 4. I think the apostles clearly understood what Jesus is saying to us this morning. And I think they took his instructions to heart. So the question is, will we? That's the challenge that I think is before us. It would be easy to try to sort of slip our way through a lot of this. And, but it's pretty straightforward, I think. I think what Jesus would have us do here is clear. And so I hope we'll take this to heart, and I pray that we will. Pray with me. Father, we confess that we are so apt to use this idea of our own rights and this idea of justice to really as a cover for our own selfish desires. We're so apt to seek our own good. God, would you search our hearts? Would you use your word to expose the thoughts and intentions of our hearts? Father, would you hold us up against the light of the image of your Son? God, we ask you would conform us to that image, that you would transform us into this kind of people, that you would make us people who increasingly reflect this kind of trust in you and this kind of character that is so indicative of your own mercy that you have shown to us. God, would you help us do this by your grace and by your Spirit? We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.